Hey there. Ever feel like some ideas just stick with you? You know, the kind that people remember and retell and even act on. Today, we're taking a deep dive into why that happens.
It is fascinating, isn't it? The stickiness of an idea. It isn't just random luck.
Yeah.
It's a science, almost like a recipe.
Okay, I'm ready to learn how to cook up some sticky ideas. Our guide is this book, Made to Stick, and it looks at everything from catchy jingles to those urban legends that just won't die.
Exactly. And you know what? They found 6 key principles at play.
Six. Okay, tell me more.
They call it the Sexy S framework, which conveniently spells out success. Kind of a sticky idea itself, right?
I see what they did there. Okay, so are you ready to make your ideas stick? Let's dive into the Success Yes formula.
I'm ready.
First up, simplicity. This isn't about dumbing things down, is it?
No, not at all. It's about finding the core of your idea.
Yeah.
Like a sculptor, chipping away at a block of marble to reveal the masterpiece inside.
Okay, so it's like finding the heart of your idea.
Exactly. What's the single most important message you want to get across? But then the question is, how do you make sure that doesn't get lost in everything else you're trying to say?
So true. So how do we do that?
You have to shrink wrap that big idea.
Yeah.
Made to stick calls us being compact. Think about proverbs, like those your grandma used to tell you. Short, powerful, packed with meaning.
Oh, right. Like, a penny saved is a penny earned.
There you go, compact and full of wisdom. The book uses a cool example. It's the team behind the Palm Pilot to keep everyone focused. They literally carved the device's key benefits onto a block of wood.
Wow. I love that. A visual proverb. So before you get lost in the weeds, before you send that long email, ask yourself, what's the one sentence that sums up the why of my idea?
That's your core message, and you need to make it shine.
Shine bright. Okay, so we've got our core message. What's next?
Okay, think about what makes you sit up and pay attention. Often it's something unexpected, right?
Oh, absolutely. I think our brains crave a little surprise every now and then.
Exactly. Our internal radar is constantly scanning for anything unusual, anything out of the ordinary.
But it can't just be random, right?
You're exactly right. The surprise needs to be meaningful. It should lead to an aha moment that connects back to the core of your idea. Like, imagine a flight attendant. Instead of that robotic safety announcement, they use humor and storytelling to engage the passengers.
Oh, that's so much more memorable. And it's still unexpected, but it's still relevant, you know?
Precisely. The book also tells this story about this journalism professor who surprised his students with an assignment. They got all the facts of the story, but the most important info was buried deep in the details.
Ah, sneaky.
It was a brilliant way to teach them about finding the core message and avoiding burying the lead.
Ah, so it's like a surprise wake-up call. How can our listeners use this idea of unexpectedness?
Well, think about a time you were surprised by something, maybe a news story or an ad or a conversation. What was it about that moment that grabbed your attention, and did it lead you to a deeper understanding? That's the power of the unexpected.
Okay, so we've got our simple core message packaged in a surprising way. But how do we make sure our idea is crystal clear so there's no room for misinterpretations?
That's where concreteness comes in. Our brains are wired to remember concrete details much better than abstract concepts.
Right. It's so much easier to grab onto something solid, I think.
Absolutely. Think about Aesop's fables. Those stories have been around for centuries because they teach universal truths, but they use concrete images. We remember the cunning fox and the sour grapes because we can picture them so vividly.
And that image helps us remember the message about wanting what we can't have. It sticks with us.
Exactly. Another example is the brown eyes, blue eyes experiment. This teacher wanted to teach her students about prejudice, so she divided them based on eye color and treated one group as superior.
Yeah, I've heard about that. It was a powerful experiment.
Really powerful. The students actually felt discrimination, and the experience was so concrete that it stayed with them for decades.
Wow. Powerful stuff. So if you're trying to explain a complex idea, try grounding it in specific people, actions, sensory details. Instead of just saying healthy eating, describe a juicy apple or a home-cooked meal.
Exactly. Concreteness is about painting a picture.
Got it. Concreteness makes those abstract ideas stick. But how do we convince people our ideas are worth believing? What makes an idea credible?
That's our fourth principle. Credibility. We want people to trust our ideas, but anyone can make a claim. So how do we back it up?
Right, we need to show our ideas have substance.
There are two main ways to establish credibility, external and internal. External is what we usually think of, like bringing in experts or data to support our claims.
Right, like 4 out of 5 dentists recommend.
Exactly. But Made to Stick argues that internal credibility can be even more powerful.
Internal credibility. So it's like the idea itself carries its own credentials.
Yes. Vivid details are key. Think about urban legends they spread because they're packed with specific, often gruesome details, and that makes them feel more real.
Oh, like the classic kidney heist story. It's horrifying, but so vivid. Of course, we're not advocating for spreading false rumors.
Of course not. But it's true. The principle holds. Concrete details add weight. The book also talks about using statistics that are relatable, human scale. Instead of saying millions of children are affected by hunger, you could say 1 in 4 children go to bed hungry.
Oh, right. That makes the statistic much more tangible. It hits closer to home.
Exactly. Made to Stick also talks about the Sinatra test.
Sinatra test. Okay, I'm intrigued. What's that?
It comes from the song, New York, New York. If I can make it there, I can make it anywhere. It's about finding an example that's so difficult, so impressive, that it proves your capability beyond any doubt. The book uses this example of a delivery company in India. They wanted to prove their reliability to a skeptical studio executive.
Oh, okay, how'd they do that?
They shared that they had successfully delivered the Harry Potter books, which had to be kept super secret, and they'd also transported the high-stakes exam papers for that executive's own brother.
Wow, mic drop moment. If you can handle Harry Potter and that executive's brother's future, you can handle anything.
Right. It's powerful. So think about the Sinatra test examples in your life. What accomplishments instantly establish your credibility?
Okay, good point. All right, so we've got simple, unexpected, concrete, and credible. What's next?
This is where it gets interesting. Emotions.
Now we're talking. Logic and facts alone don't always get people moving. We need to connect deeper.
Exactly. And Made to Stick challenges us to think differently about how we appeal to emotions. We often focus on those basic needs, security, esteem. They call it Maslow's basement, based on Maslow's hierarchy.
Like those ads that promise to make you look younger or wealthier.
Yes. But they forget about appealing to those higher needs. Belonging, learning, self-actualization.
So true. How do we tap into those?
Stories, of course. Made to Stick highlights this remarkable story about a military chef named Floyd Lee. He was stationed in Iraq.
Okay, this sounds interesting already. A military chef in Iraq.
He realized that in a war zone, food wasn't just about sustenance, it was about morale. So he transformed his mess hall into an oasis, almost. He decorated, added soft lighting, tablecloths, even had his staff wear tall chef hats.
Ah, so he brought a touch of home to this incredibly difficult situation.
He did, and the impact was huge. Soldiers would come from all over to eat in his mess hall. They said it made them feel human again.
That's the power appealing to those deeper emotional needs.
Exactly. He went beyond serving food. He was in charge of morale. So think about the causes you care about, the ideas you're passionate about. How can you connect them to people's values and aspirations?
Right. Don't just tell them what to think. Make them feel it. All right, we've covered 5 of the 6 principles. Simple, unexpected, concrete, credible, and emotional. What's the final ingredient?
Stories.
Stories. But haven't we been talking about those all along?
We have. But this principle is about recognizing the power of stories as a framework for communication. They're not just illustrations. They're how we make sense of the world.
Okay, I see. So we're going meta with stories.
Exactly. We've been telling stories since the dawn of time. It's how we pass down knowledge, how we share values. Stories are like flight simulators for our brains. They let us rehearse for future situations.
And you mentioned earlier that Made to Stick says there are 3 main types of stories that inspire action.
Yes. Challenge plots, connection plots, and creativity plots. These are universal templates that we can use to craft compelling narratives that stick.
So if I want my idea to be unforgettable, wrap it in a story that resonates with my audience.
Precisely. And stories can make even complex ideas relatable. Made to Stick shares an example of how Xerox used storytelling to improve customer service training.
Customer service. That's something we can all relate to. Tell me more.
So Xerox was having a problem with this error code, EO53. It was a real pain for the technicians because it was often misleading. So instead of adding another bullet point to the manual, they decided to tell a story about a technician who had this problem firsthand.
I bet that was more interesting than a dry manual.
Oh, way more. It was packed with details, emotion, even some jargon. It felt real.
That probably stuck with them way better than a technical explanation ever could.
Exactly. The story acted as a mental simulation. They lived through the story and were more likely to remember the lesson.
So the takeaway is to think about how you can use stories to make your ideas stickier.
Yes. Instead of just facts and figures, wrap your message in a narrative.
I like that. Okay, we've covered all 6 principles of the 6CS framework. This has been a fascinating deep dive into Made to Stick. But before we wrap up part 1, I have a question for you. The book talks about sticky ideas from urban legends to marketing campaigns to, even social movements. Do you think anyone can create sticky ideas? Or is it just like a special talent that only some people have?
That's a great question. Luckily, you don't have to be a creative genius. Made to Stick points out that while some people may be natural storytellers, these principles can be learned and applied by anyone.
Oh, that's good to know.
The book even highlights research showing that even novices can be creative, given the right tools. They describe a study where 3 groups of people had to create ads. One group got no training, just told to come up with ideas. The other 2 were given templates and strategies.
Oh, okay. So like a real world test of the success principles. What happened?
The group that received no training, their ads were rated as annoying. But the groups with the templates created ads that were much more effective.
Wow. So even if we're not quote unquote creative types, we can still learn to make our ideas stick.
Absolutely. The SECS framework gives us a roadmap. It's like having a toolkit for communication.
I love that. It means anyone can become a better communicator, whether they're pitching a product or just sharing something with a friend. So what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from this part of our deep dive?
Don't be afraid to experiment. Try applying these principles to your next presentation, email, conversation. You might be surprised how much more effectively you can communicate.
That's it for part 1 of our deep dive into the science of sticky ideas. We'll be back in part 2 to explore even more examples and insights from Made to Stick.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Made to Stick. We're picking up right where we left off, exploring how to make your ideas unforgettable.
We covered a lot of ground already. We talked about finding that core message, adding a touch of surprise, making sure everything's clear and believable. But how do we make sure these principles work in the real world? I mean, it's one thing to talk about it, but how do we actually put it into practice?
That's the key, isn't it? Putting it into action. Remember that idea of concreteness?
Yeah, our brains crave those tangible details.
Right, but sometimes you're dealing with a concept that's inherently abstract. Like, how do you make something like strategic planning feel concrete? How do you make it grab people's attention?
Yeah, strategic planning doesn't exactly scream exciting. What's the secret?
Well, Made to Stick gives this great example of a nonprofit, the Nature Conservancy. They work to protect land, which is awesome, but imagine trying to get people excited about saving, millions of acres of land.
It's hard to even picture something that vast.
Right. So instead of focusing on these huge numbers, they got smart. They focused on specific areas with unique features and gave them names, like Mount Hamilton Wilderness, Big Sur Coast. Suddenly, it's not just land. It's a place you can picture, a place with personality.
Ah, so they made it relatable.
Exactly. It's like taking something huge and breaking it down into bite-sized pieces. Think about how you could apply that in your own life. Maybe you're trying to explain a process at work. Instead of getting lost in all the jargon, could you create a metaphor or an analogy to make it easier to understand?
Ooh, that's a good idea. Like explaining it to a 5-year-old.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, another challenge we often face is making statistics memorable. We're bombarded with numbers all the time, but they just go in one ear and out the other.
Oh, tell me about it. Data overload. How do we make those numbers stick?
Well, the book talks about what they call the human scale principle. Basically, you make statistics relatable by connecting them to something we can easily grasp. Imagine you're trying to explain the impact of nuclear weapons, right? Would you cite the kilotons of explosive power?
No way. That would go right over my head.
Exactly. So instead, the book uses this amazing example. If you took all the nuclear warheads in the world and represented each one with a BB, they would fill a bathtub. And if you detonated all those BBs, it would create a crater the size of the Grand Canyon.
Whoa, that's a powerful image. And a terrifying one. Suddenly those abstract numbers become much more real.
Right. Another example is from Stephen Covey. He wrote 7 Habits. He talks about how in most workplaces, only 37% of employees understand the company's goals.
Oh, okay, that's a pretty important stat.
Yeah, but not very exciting to hear, right?
Not really.
So he uses this analogy. He asks you to imagine your team is playing soccer, and only 4 of you know where the goal is, and only 2 of you are trying to score.
Oh my gosh, that would be chaos.
Right, so those percentages become this vivid scenario We can all imagine how dysfunctional that would be. So think about how you can apply that human scale principle in your own life. How can you make those numbers real? Can you turn them into a picture, a story, something tangible?
Don't just throw numbers around, make them mean something. Okay, I like it. So we've got concreteness, credibility, and we've given those dry statistics a makeover. What about the emotional side of sticky ideas?
That's where the real connection happens. Remember Maslow's hierarchy. Made to stick challenges us to, think beyond security and esteem and tap into belonging, learning, making a difference.
It's like going beyond the basics.
Right. They even did a study where they asked people to imagine they were trying to motivate someone to take a new job. They presented 3 appeals. One focused on security, one on esteem, and one on learning.
I'm guessing most people thought security would be the most motivating.
You would think so, right? Most people predicted that others would be driven by those basic needs. But get this, when asked about themselves, what would motivate them personally?
What did they say?
They overwhelmingly chose the learning appeal. It's funny, isn't it? We tend to underestimate each other. The takeaway here is that we need to give people more credit. They care about more than just safety and status.
So how do we connect with those deeper motivations?
Stories, of course. Remember that story about Floyd Lee, the military chef in Iraq? He understood that people craved beauty and connection, even in a war zone. He didn't just serve food, he created an experience.
He nourished their souls.
Exactly. So think about your own communication. How can you move beyond those basic needs and make people feel like they belong, like they're part of something bigger?
Don't just tell people what to think, make them feel it. Okay, we've covered a lot here. Before we move on, I want to circle back to the Sinatra test. I love that idea.
If I can make it there, I can make it anywhere. It's about finding those examples that prove your capability, without a doubt.
Show, don't tell.
Exactly. Remember that story about the delivery company that handled the Harry Potter books and the exam papers?
It's like, we can handle anything.
Right. The ultimate proof. So think about those Sinatra test examples in your own life. What are those accomplishments that really demonstrate your credibility? It's not about bragging. It's about building trust.
Find those stories that make people say, wow, they're the real deal. Okay, I'm going to start a Sinatra test file. Okay, we've revisited concreteness, credibility, and the emotional side of things. Now let's dive into the 6th and final principal stories.
We've talked about stories all along, but now we're zooming out. We're going to look at stories as that framework that holds everything together.
I love it. Stories are so powerful. But why? Why are they so effective at making ideas stick?
Well, think about it. We've been telling stories forever. It's how we make sense of the world, how we connect, how we inspire action. They're like flight simulators for our brains.
They help us learn and grow and try things out in our minds.
Right. Made to Stick actually emphasizes that finding good stories starts with observation and listening. The world is full of stories.
It's about finding those everyday stories that reveal something true, something that makes us think.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The book even suggests keeping a story file, Click anecdotes and examples you come across.
Ooh, like a swipe file for stories. I like it. But, okay, you've found your story. What's next?
Now you need to shape it. Think about structure, clarity, and emotion. A good story takes you on a journey. It makes you feel something.
Make them feel something. Don't just give them information.
The book tells this great story about how the World Bank used storytelling to get their own staff on board with a new idea.
Okay, their own staff. I'm interested. What was the idea?
They were trying to promote knowledge management, the idea of sharing information.
That does sound a bit dry.
It does, right.
Yeah.
So instead of a PowerPoint, they told a story about a healthcare worker in a remote village in Zambia. He was struggling to treat malaria, limited resources. But then he gets online and he finds the answers he needs on the website of the CDC in Atlanta.
Wow, that's amazing.
It was a simple story, but so powerful. It showed the impact of sharing knowledge. It's about saving lives.
Did the story work? Did it convince the staff?
It totally did. It sparked this wave of interest within the World Bank. People suddenly understood how important it was.
Wow, a story changed the course of an entire organization. So, tell the right story. All right, so for our listeners, what's the challenge you want to leave them with as they're thinking about their own sticky ideas?
Think about how you can use stories to bring those ideas to life. What stories illustrate your message? How can you use stories to create buy-in, to inspire action?
Find those stories that stick with people, the ones they won't forget.
And remember, don't be afraid to experiment. The more you practice storytelling, the better you'll get.
I love that. This has been a great exploration of the power of stories. But before we wrap up part two, I have one final thought for our listeners to think about, maybe a little provocative.
Okay, I'm listening. Lay it on me.
We've talked about how stories make ideas come alive, but what about the opposite? Can a bad story actually make a good idea less effective?
That's a great question. It's definitely something to think about. It's not just about finding any story. It's about telling it well.
A good story poorly told is a missed opportunity.
Exactly. So we need to be mindful of the stories we choose and how we tell them. We need to be better listeners and better storytellers.
It's about finding that perfect blend of science and art.
It is, and the more we practice, the more impact we'll have.
Well said. That's it for part two of our deep dive into the science of sneaky ideas. We'll be back in part three to wrap things up and give you even more tools for making your ideas stick. Until then, keep those ideas flowing and keep striving to make them stick. Welcome back for the final part of our deep dive into Made to Stick. It's been quite a journey, exploring what makes ideas truly unforgettable.
We've covered a lot of ground, haven't we? From simplicity to stories, we've uncovered those key ingredients that make ideas stick.
And I feel like we've really learned how to make our ideas concrete and credible and, emotionally resonate with people. But now it's time to shift gears a little.
You're right, we've talked about the what, but now it's time for the how.
Hmm.
How do we actually use all of this to become better communicators?
Okay, yes. That's the big question. We've gotten all this great information, but now how do we put it into practice?
Well, that's the beauty of this 6CS framework. It's like this universal toolkit. It can be applied to almost any idea, any message, whether you're pitching a product or leading a team or just having a conversation with a friend.
It's about making an impact no matter what your goal is.
Exactly. So let's recap those key takeaways. Remember simplicity. Before you communicate anything, take a minute to really define your core message. What's that one thing you want people to remember?
Like, what's the heart of your message?
Right. Don't bury the lead. Let that core message shine. Then think about how you can add an element of surprise. Can you break a pattern, challenge an assumption, do something unexpected?
But remember, the surprise has to be meaningful. It can't just be random.
Exactly. Okay, now think about making your idea concrete. Use vivid details, sensory language, examples that people can easily grasp.
Help people see what you're talking about.
Yes. And what about credibility? How do you make your idea believable? Think about those compelling details, the Sinatra test examples, those things that build trust.
And remember, internal credibility can be just as powerful. Let the idea itself speak for itself.
Right. And then, of course, there's emotion. How can you connect with your audience on a deeper level? Make them care about your idea.
Connect with their aspirations, their desire to learn and grow. Make them feel something.
Beautifully put. And finally, remember the power of stories. Stories can bring everything together.
Which story archetype resonates with your message? Is it the challenge, the connection, or the creativity plot?
Those can help you craft a narrative that will really connect with your audience.
This has been such a fascinating exploration of Made to Stick. And as we wrap things up, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from this deep dive?
I want them to remember that making your ideas stick is a skill. And like any skill, it takes practice. So don't be afraid to experiment. Play around with these principles, try new things, and most importantly, have fun with it.
The more you use these tools, the more natural they will become.
And the more impact you'll have. So go out there, put these principles into action, and watch what you can accomplish.
That's it for our deep dive into Made to Stick. Until next time, keep those ideas flowing.